YouTube is warming up. Or the internet. Yep.
Good. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the second of 5 community series conversations. My name is Elizabeth Frost, and I'm the Chief's Executive Officer at the Zionsville Police Department. Over the next several weeks, we'll be discussing the following topics with Dr. Abbie Robinson-Armstrong, and tonight's topic will be the impact of implicit bias on individuals, organizations, and society. Each session will begin at 7 p.m. and end at 8, correct? Mm-hmm. Please feel free to type any questions you have during these sessions, and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time to answer everyone's questions tonight, please know that your question will be answered and emailed out to the group at a later time. I would like to introduce you to Captain Marius Kleiken from the Zionsville Police Department.
Thank you, Detective Frost. I appreciate the introduction. My name is Marius Kleiken. I am the captain at the Zionsville Police Department. My overall operations are in charge of the overall operations from the Zionsville Police Department here. I'd like to introduce Dr. Robinson-Armstrong for this lesson tonight.
Thank you very much. And I'm grateful to be here a second time. Hope everybody enjoys what we're going to talk about today. We're going to begin, like we always do, with the presentation overview. In terms of what we're going to cover tonight, we're going to actually get into how we learn implicit biases, and we're going to try to understand why we are so susceptible to relying on implicit biases. I'm going to talk a little bit about social cognition and implicit associations, and then we're going to get into stereotypes, because stereotypes actually form as a result of implicit bias. And we're going to end with the impact of implicit bias on individuals, organizations, and society. So prior to going into the this session, I wanted to just give us an idea about the learning objectives. I'm hoping what we walk away with tonight is that we understand how we learn biases, that we understand the concept of social cognition, and that we understand the concept of implicit associations, because those two concepts are very important. And hopefully we'll understand the impact of stereotyping on decision-making, our decision-making as well as those of our colleagues and friends and family. And eventually recognize the importance of self-reflection as a method for understanding bias. So as we move on, I want to recap Module 1. This is just my way of helping us to understand and remember what we talked about the last time. So in terms of recapping Module 1, last time we said that implicit bias is normal human attribute. Everybody has implicit biases because it's pervasive. And even though we may be committed to egalitarian values, we can hold unconscious beliefs that influence our attitudes, our behaviors, our attention. We saw that last time, our listening skills, and micro affirmations. We also learned last time that implicit bias influences the actions of other people, and that explicit bias refers to the attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or a group on a conscious level, whereas implicit bias is unconscious. So we also learned that implicit bias is malleable. And then we got into the notion that neuroscientists asserted that the amygdala, which is responsible for system 1 in the frontal and temporal lobes in our brain, relate to the activation of implicit bias. We also learned last time that Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman asserts that implicit bias is rooted in the brain. So now we have the message from neuroscientists as well as social scientists. Daniel Kahneman maintains that we have 2 systems of thinking, and we talked last time about system 1 and system 2. And finally, we learned last time that understanding implicit bias is the first step to building skills to recognize it and employing mitigation strategies. So last time we talked, I told you that there are 4 parts to the definition of implicit bias. Tonight, we're looking at the second part, which basically states that a large body of social science research demonstrated that unconscious, automatically activated, and pervasive implicit associations relate to age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, and all of the other identities that humans have, and that it impact decision making and judgments without our awareness. The one thing we need to realize is that these findings have serious, far-reaching implications for us as individuals, for organizations, and for society. Now, how do we learn implicit bias, and where do we get it from? Well, we get it from our parents, our families, family members. We get it from our friends. We get it from our peers. We learn it from the schools we attend, the media, religion that we associate with, and from our community in general. As we learn these biases, we can learn them through two different routes. First route would be direct, where somebody tells you specifically that you should not believe something or you should believe something. And then the other route that we learn them through is vicarious. And the vicarious route is through, of course, the media and religious and community and school and friends and peers. And we also know that biases are positive. They can be positive or they can be negative, and they can be accurate or they can be inaccurate. So why then are we so susceptible to relying on implicit bias? Well, first reason is we tend to seek out patterns. We love to seek out patterns when we come into a situation where the patterns are different than the ones that we are used to. We typically have to stop and think and contemplate and decide which direction we want to go into. So implicit bias occurs because of our brain's natural tendency to look for patterns and associations in the world. And the brain does that through social cognition, which is the ability to store processes and apply information about people in social situations, and is dependent on our ability to form associations about the world. If we didn't engage in social cognition, we wouldn't have all the associations in our brain about all the things that we do have associations about. So let's talk a little bit about social cognition. What is it? Well, social cognition focuses on how we process, store, and apply information about other people in social situations. It focuses on the role that cognitive processes play in our social interactions. The way we think about others plays a significant role in how we think, how we feel, and interact with the world around us. According to Jean Piaget, who's a child's cognitive development, for example, goes through a series of stages. During the earliest stage of development, children are egocentric. They see the world from their perspective and their perspective only. And they don't really know how to think about how other people view the world. As they grow older, children become better at perspective taking and have an increased ability to think about how and why people act the way they do in social situations. Now, recent research has told us that children develop the ability to think about people's perspectives at a very early age. In fact, we know now, based on the research, that preschoolers exhibit some ability to think about how other people might view a situation. And so knowing these mental states, how these mental states can influence how people act, is critical to forming social impressions and explaining how and why we do what we do. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you're getting ready to go on a blind date. Not only do you worry about the impressions and signals that you're sending to the other person, but you're also concerned with interpreting the signals given by that person. How do you form an impression of this person? What meaning do you read into the other person's behavior? That's your ability to use social cognition. That's a perfect example of social cognition. So again, why are we susceptible to relying on implicit bias? Again, because we seek out patterns. And one of the terms that psychologists have given us for seeking out patterns and storing patterns is implicit associations. And implicit association is actually a connection between ideas, behaviors, events, objects, or feelings on a conscious or unconscious level. When one concept is primed, the other one becomes more accessible without our conscious deliberation. For example, if I said to you, bread, first thing you might think about in an automatic fashion is butter. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about implicit associations. Because implicit associations arise outside of our conscious awareness, they don't necessarily align with our openly held beliefs or reflect the stances that we would explicitly endorse. For example, let me give you an example here. An association was made in a man's brain that connected his dog to comfort. And that's the same association I have with dogs. Because the dog provided him comfort each time he became upset. The man, of course, always thinks of the dog. When he sees the dog, when the dog is in his presence, he thinks of comfort. So do I. So we continue to talk about implicit associations. And one of the important things we need to walk away with is the fact that once an association has been activated, it's very difficult to inhibit it. And a lot of the smoke inhibiting studies really, focus in on the fact that once you've acquired an association for a particular concept, it's almost impossible to shake the two apart. So despite what you may feel like is a natural inclination to get rid of one of the other associations that you've attached to a particular concept or particular idea, your attempts to debias by repressing those biased thoughts, according to the research, are probably and almost always ineffective, because we all experience something called the rebound effect, which is suppressing automatic associations, or at least trying to suppress the automatic associations that pop up in our brain. But it doesn't reduce them, and it actually sometimes will amplify them by making them hyper accessible. There's one example I want to share with you from the smoking situation. The research on smoking, smoking has identified the fact that the more people try to, eliminate their need to smoke, the more smoking becomes amplified, and actually the more they smoke. So another reason we are so susceptible to implicit bias is that we like to take shortcuts, and we talked about that the last time. Like other cognitive biases, implicit bias is the result of our brain's tendency to try to simplify the world, because the world is constantly inundated with more than it can process. I'm sorry, the brain, rather, is inundated with more than information that it can process. Mental shortcuts makes it easier and faster to sort through large amounts of data. In fact, the research tells us that our brain actually processes 11 million bits of data per minute, if you can imagine that. Another reason why we are so susceptible to relying on our biases is that implicit biases are, influenced by our experiences. Although the attitudes that we pick up through experiences may not be the result of direct personal experience. And we know that because we talked about the fact that we pick up stuff through vicarious experiences as well as real, or what one would call personal experiences. And we also know that cultural conditioning and media portrayals and upbringing can all contribute to implicit associations that we form about the members of other social groups in our world. Now, I want to move on to your story. Did it move?
No. Let me see here. Second. Okay.
There we are. Okay, now basically what we've said here is that your story, your vicarious experiences, and your real and personal experiences, plus your background, plus, all of your life experiences actually end up being your story. And your background and all of your life experiences actually inform all of your biases. And that's one reason all of us have different types of biases. Now, I know that we can't talk about this, but I put this in here because I want you to think about it. I want you to reflect on your story. I want you to think, for example, about a significant event in your own life. How did that event shape your values or the way you view the world? And how did it impact or affect the way you perceive others? And finally, how did it affect the way you interact with other people? Think about that. We're going to take about a couple minutes before we move on and give you an opportunity to reflect on your story. Your story, remember, comprises your experiences and your background. All righty, let's move on. So, one of the important things that the research tells us that implicit biases are often based on stereotypes rather than on the actual knowledge about an individual, a group, or circumstances. So implicit bias then can result in prejudgments that lead to rash decisions, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. The use of stereotypes is a major way to simplify our social world, since they reduce the amount of processing or thinking that we have to do when we meet up with a new person. But stereotyping, by stereotyping, we basically inferring that a person has a whole range of characteristics and abilities that we assume all group members have. Stereotypes then lead to social categorizations, which is one reason for prejudicial attitudes. And for example, the I or the them and us sort of mentality that some of us have. So let's compare implicit bias versus stereotypes. Implicit bias is a tendency to or preference toward a particular perspective, ideology, or result, especially when the tendency interferes with the ability to be impartial, unprejudiced, or objective. Stereotype, on the other hand, is an overly generalized assumption about a group of people. It's generally based on limited experience, meaning that you don't have much experience with that particular group of people, much experience that would give you an accurate set of knowledge about that particular group of people or that individual. It's based on misinformation. Sometimes it's based on fear or other factors that discount individuality and keep the word individuality in mind. Because when we're talking about stereotyping, we need to focus on whether or not we understand individuality and we are capable of using that term and putting it to use when we come in contact with people in our world. Stereotypes, we know, are arbitrary ways of categorizing people. And the reason they are is because there's no social group that's homogeneous. None homogeneous. Stereotypes might not accurately represent the characteristics of a particular group member. For example, I'm going to use myself. If you were to categorize all African Americans in the United States, put them into one category, you'd have a lot of inaccurate information because there are numerous cultural groups among African Americans in this country. Stereotypes, on the other hand, may come from images you see in the media or social values. For example, parents, teachers, and the community can teach you to believe certain stereotypes, even if those stereotypes aren't true, because most of us don't take the time to try to figure out whether the stereotype is positive or negative, or whether it's accurate or whether it's inaccurate. So let's talk about the fact that stereotypes may be positive or negative. Usually the positive stereotypes are about your own group, such as when women suggest that they are likely to complain about physical pain. In most cases, stereotypes are negative, usually toward other groups outside of your own setting, such as when members of a dominant group suggest that a subordinate group is stupid or lazy. Regardless of whether they are positive or negative, doesn't matter whether it's the stereotypes you hold about your members of your own group, or whether it's negative stereotypes you hold about people that are not part of your group. All stereotypes are generalizations, and they don't take, again, into account individual differences. That we need to remember. And that can help us in the long run to stop stereotyping, or to begin to ask ourselves questions when we find ourselves in a stereotypical mode. Stereotypes and behavior. Stereotype is the idea. It's an overgeneralized idea that connects group members and traits about a group. Prejudice, on the other hand, is the belief that a stereotype or overgeneralization is actually true, that you believe that it's actually true. And that belief then leads to discrimination or behavior acting in line with the stereotype or the prejudice. In other words, whatever information you have about the specific stereotype, that behavior leads to discrimination and leads you to act, in line with the stereotype or the prejudice. One of the things we have to remember is, in this country, stereotypical labels run rampant. A stereotypical name or label is basically naming a perceived group with a term that implies superiority, inferiority, or an in-group or out-group status. Some labels are openly derogatory or insulting, while other labels imply that a perceived group is substandard, disdained, or unacceptable. Now, I know that you can think of many labels that exist in your environment that would be labeled as stereotypical labels. I can think of lots of them. I typically try not to use them when I'm at this point in the slide, because I don't want to color anybody's thoughts. The other thing that we have to remember here is that trigger words and slurs are also running rampant across this country. Terms or phrases that have a negative connotation for some or all members of a perceived group. And those terms can generate anger, frustration, embarrassment, or fear in the targeted group. For example, wetback as an implication that people of Hispanic origin are illegal immigrants, because the stereotype information is that they all cross the Rio Grande by swimming. I think we really need to focus on these kinds of stereotypical instances, slurs and words, because they can help us live. If we can eliminate some of this from our society, that can help us live a much better life and make us happy. And also, I want to focus on the second term up there, the fact that the terms stereotypical words and slurs can actually generate anger, frustration, embarrassment, or fear in the targeted group. And think about that now. Think about the whole notion of the Black Lives Matter movement and people wondering why certain people are so attached to that movement. It's because the terms and, the slurs that they've been exposed to during their lifetime has created or generated, a lifelong list of angry, frustration, embarrassment, and fear. I hope that helps you understand why we want to sort of limit the amount of trigger words and slurs that we use in our country, and especially in Zionsville, because I live here and I love this place. Let's look at some examples of negative stereotypes. Age, for example, some people think that older people are inflexible and out of date. Disability, a stereotype about disability, a person with hearing disability lacks interpersonal communication skills. Not true. Gender, women are not rational. Of course we're rational. Nationality, people from the Middle East are anti-American. Not so. Culture, Latinos don't want to speak English. Not so. Physical attributes, obese people have no self-control. Well, let me tell you, I don't have any self-control when it comes to eating sweets, and I'm not obese. Socioeconomic status, poverty is a lifestyle choice by lazy people. Not so. I grew up very poor in a small, in Tallahassee, Florida, and I don't consider myself lazy, never considered myself lazy, never have been lazy. I graduated from high school, went straight to college for the next 12 years. I don't think you would call that lazy, but I was still poor. And you know that college students, unless they come from wealthy families, they are definitely in the poor, in the poor lane. Mm-hmm. So there's a critical question for you. When was the last time you heard a stereotypical slur, a prejudicial, discriminatory, or racist statement, or an offensive joke, and you didn't address the situation? Just take a minute and think about that. Think about whether, if you had addressed that situation, whether the person who was making those slurs or the statements or jokes, whether they might have learned something about you, something wonderful about you, and whether or not it might have caused them some angst in terms of trying to think about whether it's appropriate to use slurs and, prejudicial and statements and offensive jokes among people that you don't know whether or not those people actually accept and believe in that kind of language. So the question a lot of people ask then, okay, we talk about positive and negative stereotypes, but are they true? Well, according to the social sciences, there is a historical context behind almost all stereotypes, and they may be based in part on fact. Now let's look at this example. The social science literature documented a strong link between economic status, ethnicity, and street crimes. Fact number 1. Lower income people are disproportionately represented among people who commit street crimes. Fact number 2. People of color are disproportionately represented in lower income levels. Fact number 3. 1 plus 2 equals C. Equals 3 rather. I have A and plus B, but let's substitute that for 1 plus 2 equals 3. So people of color are disproportionately represented among those who commit street crimes. Conversely, on the other hand, rather, higher income individuals are underrepresented among those who commit street crimes. And the social science literature tells us that they are more likely to commit what we call white collar crimes. I hope that helps you understand and figure out whether, social stereotypes are actually true. Next time you are involved in a stereotypical situation where someone is talking about a particular, using, stereotypical language, you might want to pose a question in terms of, is that true? And okay, what's the context around this? Help me understand, how did it come about? How did this particular stereotype, how did it, get into the language of the people in the United States? Where did it come from? What was going on? What was the context? Ask those kind of questions, and you can then do what social science call stereotype busting. Because once you start to ask people those kinds of questions, they step back, and because they don't usually have the answer, and they haven't even thought about it. Even if they did have it, they haven't thought about it. So it's a good way to convey the notion that stereotypes are not necessarily true, and we don't need to go around throwing them around our neighborhoods and our communities and the places in which we live. So I promised you tonight that we would look at all kinds of examples of bias. The first type of bias we're going to look at is called everyday implicit bias. There are numerous types of implicit bias, but we're going to look at everyday implicit bias. So look at the first picture here. What we see is a perfect example of bias in the media. The photos were taken in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. One photo at the top, the one at the top was taken by the Associated Press, which is the press that we use primarily here in the United States. And the second was taken by the Associated Foreign Press. These photos demonstrate how a news reporter can share his or her own bias with readers, or if you were on television, with people who are listening to the TV. Although the people in both pictures are engaged in the same activity, if you look at the pictures, they're both carrying food that they've gotten from some grocery store or someplace, and they're trying to, get to a safe place. However, what you actually see is that the difference in the language, although, as I said, the people are engaged in the same activity, the Associated Press says a young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. That's that particular reporter's implicit bias. Okay, so the same thing happening, but the Associated Foreign Press says 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through the area in New Orleans. See the difference? Just one word: looting and finding. Looting makes it a negative situation, negative story. finding makes it a positive story. Here are some more examples of everyday bias. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, you notice that there are there's some smaller words, and those words basically tell you that where I got this information from. I put this there, and I always do this because I am a social scientist, and also because I want you to know that I'm not making this stuff up. So, an Asian woman was harassed by a man who cursed at her and told her, "You're the one who brought the coronavirus, the virus here." After the woman tried to record him on her cell phone, he slapped her phone away. Another example. A candidate for U.S. Congress, and this was actually in California, barged into a bathroom stall of a transgender woman and screamed, "There's a man here saying that he's a lady." In a restaurant in New York City, a man berated customers and employees for speaking Spanish, and then he threatened to call the immigration officials. Now, you know, we see these all the time in the news. This kind of stuff is what we call everyday implicit bias. It happens every day, all day long across this country. Every day, all day long. Let's look at another one. In this situation, we have an African-American woman attempts to board a plane during first-class seating. When she's attempting to board the plane during first-class seating, several passengers also boarding looked at her suspiciously like, "Oh, well, now we know you're in the wrong lane." The airline attendant asked her, "Are you sure you're in this section?" And then the woman showed her ticket. Airline attendant looked at the ticket, and then she called her supervisor because she was not convinced that there wasn't something wrong here. This happens a lot to women sometimes. It happens a lot to people of color all across this country. It happens, it even happens in Zionsville. I'll give you an example. I built a house in Zionsville, and when people come to work, do some work on my house, for example, I go to the door when they ring the doorbell, and they say to me, this has happened several times since I've been here, "I'm here to do some work, whatever the work is, for Dr. Robinson-Armstrong. Could you go get her?" Now, you can read between the lines there. What they're thinking in their head is, this woman couldn't possibly be living in Zionsville because this is a white community. So let's look at the everyday implicit bias. And this is for parents. I put this in here for all parents because the textbooks that your children are reading in schools are filled up with bias, and not only just the textbooks, but much of the instructional material that your children are, faced with in your school setting. It's filled up with bias. The curriculum perpetuates bias by presenting only one interpretation of an issue, situation, or group of people. For example, textbooks report that women were given, and I use given in quotation marks, the vote. But the textbook, on the other hand, doesn't explain the work, the sacrifices, and the physical abuse that some of the leaders of the suffrage movement actually experienced, that won the vote, and they weren't given the vote. They had to do a lot of work over many years to acquire the vote, to win the vote. Literature in the textbook could be drawn primarily from Western and male authors. If you're a parent on this conversation tonight, look at your children's textbooks to see, look at number one, who are the authors of the stories they're reading? And where are they coming from? Are they all from the United States, or are they all from Western nations? Or is there a diversity of literature in your children's textbooks? And also, one of the really important things you want to do in terms of your children's textbooks is to look at the formulas and the discoveries that are, included in the math and science course textbooks, because often the textbooks will focus specifically on European discoveries and formulas, and not necessarily formulas from other countries. And we all know that many other countries have discovered all kinds of formulas and created all kinds of things that help us to live better. And if you, for example, if you keep up with the Nobel laureates, the Nobel prizes each year, you can actually see that in happening, because often you'll see that a scientist in the United States, a scientist in Britain, a scientist in Prague or some other country, 5 scientists won the prize for some kind of scientific, so whatever it is they were working on. And you can see that, we're not the only folks that come up with formulas and discoveries and all kinds of things that help us to live better. And your children should be exposed to that very notion, that the discoveries and the formulas are in this country that we enjoy were created often by many folks that don't live in this country, actually. So here's a critical question for all of us tonight. I want you to take a minute to reflect on the examples of everyday bias that we just talked about. So what do you think the impact of this kind of bias is on the targeted individuals? How do you think it impacts them? How does it impact others who identify with the group that the targeted individuals belong to? That's a real critical question. How does it impact those people who belong to the same group that the targeted individual belongs to? And how does this kind of bias affect our society as a whole? If you think about it, everyday bias has a huge impact on our society as a whole. Every time something pops up in the news in terms of everyday bias, a whole lot of people in this country get upset. Because first of all, we don't think that it's still around. We don't want to believe that it's still around, it's still happening. But we also don't want to think that we treat our relatives and not our relatives, but we don't want to think that we treat people the way we do sometimes. And we use words to do it. So can you think about what can you yourself do about everyday bias? Walk away with this question in your head. What can you do about it? What have you tried to do about it in the past? And think about, if it worked, did it work? Then you want to continue doing whatever you did. But what can you do about it in the future? Can you change the strategy you used in some way so that you can even be more effective in terms of helping us to control everyday bias across this country and in our neighborhood and in our communities? There's a book that you might want to, if you've got a pencil, write this down. It's called Everyday Bias: Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Lives. What this book helps you to understand is when you realize or come in contact with everyday bias situations, the book helps you to understand how to react, what to do, what not to do in order to navigate the bias. So you may want to write that down. It's available on Amazon. I think I paid about $10 for the book. It's not very expensive at all. I also want to share with us some sample research studies that more or less help us to understand that bias, again, is everywhere. So here's a study. There were, this study was in 2004, and the researchers wanted to determine whether implicit racial bias affected the hiring decisions. They hypothesized that despite the same qualifications listed in resumes, employers would call white applicants at a higher rate than African American applicants. So what the researchers did is they created fictitious resumes which varied in quality. A higher quality resume contained more experience, certifications, and honors than a lower quality resume. They randomly assigned very white sounding names, such as Emily, Ann, Todd, and Neil, to half of the resumes, and very African American sounding names, such as Akia, Keisha, Rashad, and Termini, to the other half. 2 higher quality and 2 lower quality resumes were sent to each employer, to each one, a total of 5,000, and I did say 5,000 resumes covering a vast array of jobs within the fields of sales, clerical, administrative support, and customer service were sent to over 1,300 employers who placed advertisements in Chicago and Boston. The researchers tracked the number of callbacks the fictitious resumes received. I think if you push, you might come up with some. Yeah, okay. So what did they find? They found that the resumes with the white sounding names received 50% more calls for interviews. 50% more calls for interviews. They found that the employers were more likely to call whites than African Americans, even though the resumes with the white sounding names were of lower quality. However, higher quality resumes received more calls. Nevertheless, for African American applicants, the difference between a lower quality resume and a higher quality resume presented minimal gains. A lower quality resume with an African American sounding name had 6.2 chances of receiving a call, whereas a higher quality resume had 6.7% chance of receiving a call. In addition, higher quality resumes with African American sounding names received fewer calls than lower quality resumes with white sounding names. Now, this business of the naming business has been a serious problem it's been a serious problem in almost every area in this country, especially in corporate America. And there's lots and lots and lots of articles out there on this situation, that supports this research. The fact that people look at the resume and they immediately, in their head, implicit associations, we know what an implicit association is. It jumps up and it says, even though they don't even bother to look at the criteria, whether I graduated from kindergarten and then got into first grade and maybe end up in junior high. They don't look at that. They look at my name and they say, oh, this person couldn't possibly be qualified for this position. And by the way, if anybody wants these research studies, you can contact the town of Zionsville, and I will make sure that I send them to you. Let's talk about science faculty and subtle gender bias. One of the things that those of us in education know, and I think everybody knows that, you know that there are many more male scientists in this world in this country than there are female scientists. So there are lots of studies that have been conducted to try to figure out, well, why is this true? Why is this so? Why don't women get accepted into the science programs across this country so that they can end up with a PhD and end up studying science and creating a better world for all of us? In 2012, researchers conducted a study to determine whether 127 faculty in biology, chemistry, and physics departments at 3 public and 3 private large geographically diverse research universities in the United States had gender biases that favor male students over female students. They also examined the factors that mediated or shaped those biases. So what did they hypothesize? They hypothesized that if given an equally qualified male and female student, science faculty would demonstrate preference for males when asked the following questions: asked to rate the student's competency, asked to determine their hireability, asked to select an annual starting salary, and to indicate how much career mentoring they would actually need in order to become an excellent scientist. So the researchers created these fictitious applications and they sent them out to the participants. Now, what did they find? They found that the faculty participants rated male applicants as more competent, more hireable than female applicants who had the exact same qualifications. The participants also offered more career mentoring to the male applicants than to female applicants. And that can cause a huge problem for females in the sciences. In fact, that can cause a huge problem for any female in a PhD program, because you can't get through a PhD program without having an advisor who's going to mentor you throughout the program. It's just not going to happen if you don't have that strong mentoring content. So the researchers also found that faculty participants selected a higher starting salary for participants. For the male participants, they actually offered the male participants $30,238, and the female applicants were offered $26,000. It's the really important point I want to make here. It's really important to know that both male and female faculty exhibited the same gender bias against female applicants. Isn't that interesting? The same gender bias against female applicants. They also demonstrated that the gender of the reviewer didn't really make a difference. Didn't make a difference at all. So the researchers finally discovered and concluded that the reason for this disparity was that faculty participants who were less likely to hire a female student viewed them as less competent. That's sad, but it's a lot of research. Good. Okay, another study. You can see on this slide what we just talked about. Male applicants and female applicants. We talked about competence, hireability. We talked about mentoring. So let's move on to the next slide. We can see that you can see the $30,238 as opposed to $26,508. Now, this is a very interesting study. In a 2013 study, research examined whether defendant's weight influenced the juror's perception of guilt. I'm going to say that one more time, because when I read this study, I was like, that couldn't be. How could my weight have anything to do with whether I'm guilty or not? So I'm going to read this one more time. In a 2013 study, and you can see at the bottom of the slide there, this study and who it was conducted by, research examined whether a defendant's weight influenced jurors' perception of guilt. They hypothesized that female defendants would be judged more heavily than lean female defendants, obese female defendants would be judged more harshly than lean female defendants. Okay, so let's find out what they actually, the actual conclusion here. The researchers concluded that body weight and the sex of a defendant affected the perception of the amount of the guilt among jurors. They found that male participants judged the obese female defendants as significantly guiltier than the lean female defendants. The lean male participants believed the obese female defendants were more aware of her crime than the lean female defendant. And finally, the researchers also found that male respondents who were leaner judged the obese female defendants as significantly guiltier than the females who were not quite as heavy set. So this particular study raised a lot of concern when it came out across the scientific world, the social science world, because it more or less indicates that weight can shape the perception of a juror, and based on your weight, you can get a lot more time than you might have had if you've been thin and ate them carrots and nothing but carrots. Go on. Yeah, next. There's another one, bias in the doctor's office. When a pharmaceutical company, and this study was a really good one and made me think a lot about before I go to the doctor again. When pharmaceutical companies give samples to doctors, the doctors may think that the samples don't affect their decision about which medicines they prescribe, because they don't focus on the fact that the samples can bias their prescriptions. However, researchers prove that, if you ask the doctors whether the samples might unconsciously bias their colleagues' decisions, most of the doctors said yes. Of course it can bias my colleague's decision, but it certainly doesn't bias my decision. That's called bias blind spot. That social scientists gave that term, that kind of situation where you think, we all think that my friend is more biased than me, or my colleague is more biased than me. It's called bias. In other words, we all have our bias blind spot about our own bias. Let's go on, move on, because we don't have much more time here. North Carolina, racial disparities of suspension for the first-time offender. Let's look at this, rather quickly. First-time African-American student is in the orange. First-time suspension for having a cell phone. First-time suspension about the dress code. First-time suspension about being disruptive. And a first-time suspension based on display of affection. I think you can make a lot of sense out of that slide. So let's move on. Here's another study. This was conducted by the Yale Child Study Center. 136 preschool teachers watched a video of four children playing. One child was white female, one child was a white male, one child was an African-American female, another child was an African-American male. The teachers were told to look for challenging behavior among the students, and their eye movements were tracked while they watched the video. Okay, video is over. The teachers spent most of their time observing the African-American male child, and when they were asked to identify the child that would have the most challenging situation or create the most challenging behavior, have the most challenging behavior, they identified the African-American male child. Let's move on to another one. This is very interesting study. Very, very interesting study. Repeated studies in the literature demonstrates that people, including police departments, people in the police departments across the country. Because remember, police are people. They perceive young African American men as bigger, taller, heavier, more muscular, and more physically threatened, stronger, and more capable of harm than young white men of the same actual size, the exact same size. So where's that implicit association? It's in their head. Participants in these studies were more likely to condone the hypothetical use of force against African American men compared to white men on the basis of this perceived threat. And remember, it's because their perception, their implicit association is that African American men are taller, heavier, more muscular, and more physically threatened. All right, let's go on to another one. We can go on to it. Let's move on to one more so we can. A study of cardiologists found that implicit gender bias was associated with differences in simulated clinical decisions about cardiac testing for hypothetical male and female patients who had similar likelihoods of obstructive coronary artery disease. Very interesting. Now, if they treat women and men, their perception about women and men are different. The women or the female patient is going to get different sort of treatment than the male patient. And these kind of studies are the types of studies that we really have to stay abreast of. And the medical field, of course, is staying abreast of this kind of stuff. And many hospitals and schools of medicine are basically trying to deal with these kinds of biases that people come to medical school with and actually leave with as well. So I wanted to put that there so that we could see that biases, are all over the place. So I sent you yesterday, and I apologize for sending it late, and I will never do that again. But I sent to you some information about Harvard University's implicit association test. And there are about 14 tests that you can take on age and race and politics and gender, all kinds of topics that you can take a test on. I would encourage you, just for your own sake, because this is for you, not for me. And no one's going to ask you, and no one's going to, and if you actually read the material, you'll actually know that no one's going to know who you are and know that you took the test except for you. Take this test, take several of the tests to try to figure out where your biases are, because you really can't own up to your biases unless you know what they are and you can at least, acknowledge that they're there. And then at that point, you begin to say to yourself, okay, well, let me try to do something about it. Now, next time, I think this is sliding. The next Thursday, we're going to meet here again, and we're going to talk about just what do you do to manage the influence of bias on yourself. There's a lot of studies and a lot of scientific evidence that tells us what we can do to help manage our bias. And I'm also going to talk about what do we do to respond to bigoted language, because if you don't respond to it, it just continues to, be there. It's there, and the person that is using that language doesn't even understand that it's not appropriate sometimes. So those are the two subjects that we're going to talk about next time. And I just want to say thank you for being here with us today, and I hope you learned something.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robinson-Armstrong. Okay, so we will see if we have any questions and questions here. Okay. Okay, so we have I think it's a comment and a question from Dr. Robinson, who's he's the superintendent of the Zionsville Community Schools. And so let me read that to you. Hi, Scott Robinson here, local school superintendent. We are engaged in a years-long effort to ensure that a multiple perspectives lenses is utilized when choosing instructional material. We have completed a year of equity walks through school classrooms by outside experts to assist us in making certain that singular perspective displays and areas of focus are enhanced toward multiple perspectives, origins, etc. This and other has been ongoing, but will not be done for the foreseeable future. Ours were the first schools in Indiana to require implicit bias training for all employees starting 4 years ago. We have engaged in staff and student trainings, community conversations, and so much more. Will you please amplify our efforts to parents by asking that they read or listen to important resources like Wickerson's books, Cast and Stevenson's books, and the movie of the same name, Just Mercy. Please ask that parents engage with their school's efforts in this important work.
Wow, that is really wonderful.
Yes.
That is absolutely wonderful. Congratulations to Zionsville Community Schools and to the superintendent who's the leader in causing all of this wonderful things to happen. I am very, I'm feeling very good about building a house in Zionsville today. Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Okay, and that looks like that's all the questions and comments that we have for this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and of course, thank you, Dr. Robinson-Armstrong. We appreciate you and everything you're doing for our community. So please tune back in with us next Thursday at 7 p.m. and we will discuss managing the influence of implicit bias.
Right.